Hello, and welcome to the Banker's Tech Talk video series, looking at all things fintech. We've been going now for 6 years, and you can watch all previous episodes on thebanker.com/techtalks. I'm Joy Macknight, editor of The Banker, and I'm joined this week by Helene Panzarino, who's CEO of New Financial Laboratory and author of the recently published Reinventing Banking and Finance, Frameworks to Navigate Global Fintech Innovation. Thanks so much for joining me, Helene.
It's an absolute pleasure, Joy, always to watch and to be part of.
So first, can you tell me a little bit about the new book and the main trends that you're picking out in terms of banking and fintech innovation today?
Absolutely. And the book, which of course would have been finished and created before we went into COVID, something to keep in the background, really came about because we were realizing that hyper-personalization in banking and finance, and in particular the impact of fintech and technology, reminded us and was reminiscent of banking hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, in fact. And we went all the way back to 13th century Genoa for the start of the book to take a historical perspective. As it is in football, it's a game of two halves. So the first part of the book starts with way back with hyper-personalization as it existed then, moves on to the industrial bank, the IT bank, the digital bank. And along the way, we look at the challenges, we look at other industries, of course, that were disrupted. We all know the Kodak, Shopify, all the other examples where people didn't look up above the parapet quickly enough. And then we move on to fintech and fintech tribes and innovators. And then the second half of the book, we take a journey around to 6 different hubs, as it were. So if you found yourself in one of these cities like Tel Aviv or Paris or London, where would you go and who would you speak to if you wanted to get into fintech?
Excellent. That's so interesting. And I know you also focus a little bit on the community banks, especially in the US. What kind of challenges do you think they're facing today?
I'm a super fan of the community banks, yes. And I'm also watching, of course, in the US, where I'm from, although I live in London, with a positive outlook, because I think they have challenges, but they have opportunities. And if we look at what happened, for example, with the pandemic and the stimulus packages and the money that went into the accounts, in my case in particular, I'm interested in the SMB market, most of that first 9 billion got out the door and into accounts by community banks, and predominantly in the Midwest. What I love about community banks is that they have that community in its true sense, community of affinity. They have a trusted relationship that came about over a period of time. What they might not have had was a digital plan, a strategy that was being implemented, for example, at the time of the pandemic, which would have been accelerated if they had one, and would have shown warts and all weaknesses if they did not have one when everything started. And I think that's the challenge for smaller banks who don't have millions or billions of dollars to spend experimenting with launching neobanks or digital banks. If you're at the C-suite of one of those banks, this is a make or break potentially for you. It could go very well or not very well if you're on a digital transformation path.
Okay, and how do you think that they can really ramp up their digital offerings? And how can they deliver this hyper-personalization that you were talking about before?
Yeah, I mean, the community banks, as we can look at, they're being, let's say, flanked and assaulted in a number of ways, not just from the large incumbent banks, but also from fintechs. And of course, we can see some fintechs have actually acquired some of the smaller banks, right? Lending platforms that have acquired banks in order to get the banking license. There's the big tech, so the Googles and the PayPals and the Stripes that are also, putting in their oar into the mix. And then, of course, there are the incumbents that are rolling out the digital propositions. So for them, this is a moment where, and let's not forget, everyone is also, they're in a core provider contract, usually for a period of time. So it's not so easy to switch up gears. Now, the front end, the UX, that digital experience, for example, for these individual and retail and corporate customers is one part of it, but actually efficiencies in the middle and the back end are the other part of going digital. And then now that you've got all these new customers that filled, swollen deposits from the stimulus packages, how do you offer something like a marketplace solution or a better POS lending solution that actually retains this custom? Because now the challenge is, how do you retain this custom? Is that just, fixing up and prettying up the front end? Or can you do more by partnering with fintechs, getting your cores to partner with fintechs, or contemplating your own outside of the mothership, outside of business as usual digital offering?
Excellent. And my last question is, I know you lecture at several London universities specifically on fintech. Why do you think, or what is driving young people's interest in fintech?
I teach on a master's in entrepreneurship, but I also teach at the London Institute of Banking and Finance on executive education, for example. And we see it from both sides, from our own active community and from master's courses. Everyone understands that now fintech is starting to achieve its zenith of being embedded into a transaction without us having to leave a website, for example, and go somewhere else, and actually starting to really meet the needs of the customer.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Helene.
Pleasure.